Eleanor Hayes stood in the quiet hush of the airport terminal, her hands folded neatly over the handle of a small, well-worn suitcase. She wasn't one for fuss or fanfare, but today felt different. Today was special. Not because of the flight, not because of the destination, but because of the reason behind it. Her son, the boy she'd raised alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Atlanta, the one she'd stayed up nights praying over while working double shifts as a school cafeteria aide, was being honored at a major industry event on the other side of the country, and he'd done something so thoughtful, so unlike the hurried, distracted world around her, that it had brought tears to her eyes when the envelope arrived. Inside that envelope was a first-class ticket, round trip, and a handwritten note that read, "You've always flown coach for me, Mama. Now it's my turn to give you the sky." She'd never flown first class in her life. In fact, she rarely flew at all. Most of her trips were by bus or train, practical and frugal the way she'd been taught. But this was a gift wrapped in kindness, and she wasn't about to let pride or habit get in the way of accepting it. So she'd pressed her best dress, the soft lavender one with the lace collar, and packed her Bible, her reading glasses, and a small photo of her late husband, just in case she needed a moment of quiet strength mid-flight. Now, standing near gate B12, she checked her boarding pass one more time. The letters 1A were printed clearly under her name. First row, window seat. She smoothed the paper with her thumb, a small smile tugging at her lips. She remembered how her son used to trace letters on her palm when he was little, practicing his ABCs. Now he was a man who moved in circles she'd only seen on the news. Still, he never forgot her. Never acted like he was too big for Sunday phone calls or birthday cards with $5 bills tucked inside. The gate area began to fill. Business travelers with rolling briefcases, families wrangling toddlers, couples holding hands. Eleanor kept to herself, sitting upright in a plastic chair, her posture straight from decades of teaching children to sit like you mean it. She watched as others approached the desk, mostly men in suits, a few women in sharp blazers, and each time they handed over their first-class passes, they were greeted with warm smiles and quick nods toward the jet bridge. Then it was her turn. She walked slowly but steadily to the counter, her low-heeled shoes clicking softly on the tile. The gate agent, a young woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a name tag that read Tiffany, barely looked up as Eleanor placed her boarding pass on the counter. "Good morning," Eleanor said gently. Tiffany glanced at the pass, then at Eleanor, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. Her eyes flickered over Eleanor's modest dress, her sensible shoes, the simple gold cross at her throat. She tapped a few keys, frowned slightly, and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but there's been a system error." Eleanor blinked. "A system error?" "Yes," Tiffany said, her tone polite but firm, already turning to her screen as if the matter were closed. "Your seat's been reassigned. We had some last-minute VIP upgrades and your reservation got bumped to economy." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "But this is a first-class ticket. It was purchased directly through the airline, see?" She pointed to the bold first-class label at the top of the pass. "I understand, ma'am," Tiffany replied, not meeting her eyes. "But the system shows your seat is no longer available. We've rebooked you in 28F. It's a window seat, too." "Very comfortable." Eleanor took a slow breath. She wasn't angry. Anger wasn't her way. But she felt a familiar sting, the kind that came not from loud insults but from quiet dismissals. She'd felt it before, when store clerks followed her through aisles, when neighbors assumed she was the nanny, not the homeowner. It wasn't always said out loud, but it was always there, a whisper that said, "You don't belong here." Still, she kept her voice calm. "I don't understand." "My son bought this ticket specifically for first class. He works in the aviation industry. He made sure it was confirmed." Tiffany's fingers paused on the keyboard. "I'm sure he did, ma'am. But the system doesn't lie. And right now it says you're in economy. I can't override that." A man behind Eleanor cleared his throat impatiently. "Some of us have actual first-class tickets," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Eleanor's cheeks warmed, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she looked directly at Tiffany. "Is there a supervisor I can speak with?" Tiffany hesitated, then sighed. "Ma'am, I am the supervisor for this gate. And I'm telling you, there's nothing I can do. The flight's boarding in 10 minutes. If you'd like to fly today, you'll need to take the seat we've assigned." The words landed like stones. Eleanor could argue. She could raise her voice, demand answers, make a scene, but she'd spent a lifetime choosing dignity over drama. She'd taught her son to do the same. So she simply nodded, picked up her boarding pass, and said, "Thank you." She turned and walked back to her seat, her steps measured, her head high. Inside, though, a quiet storm raged. Not at the airline, not even at the gate agent, but at the world that still, in 2024, made a 70-year-old woman feel like she had to prove she deserved comfort, respect, or even a window seat. As she waited for economy boarding to begin, she noticed a man in a dark hoodie and sunglasses sitting a few rows away, watching her. He looked familiar, broad shoulders the way he held himself, but she couldn't place him. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and something in his eyes made her heart skip. Was that? No, it couldn't be. He wouldn't be here, not like this. Not in disguise, but then again, he'd always been full of surprises. Boarding for economy began, and Eleanor rose with the crowd. She moved slowly down the jet bridge, her suitcase rolling behind her, her lavender dress catching the fluorescent light. She found seat 28F, tucked her bag under the seat in front, and settled in. The cabin was loud, crying babies, overhead bins slamming shut, the hum of engines starting up. She closed her eyes and whispered a short prayer. Lord, help me not to carry bitterness. Help me remember that my worth isn't decided by a seat assignment. Minutes later, the man in the hoodie walked past her row. He paused just for a second, and their eyes met. Eleanor's breath caught. It was him, her son, but he didn't say a word, just gave her that same quiet nod, then disappeared into the front of the plane. Her heart pounded. What was he doing? Why wasn't he in first class? And why was he dressed like that? She didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. For now, she opened her Bible to Psalms, found her place with a worn ribbon, and tried to focus on the words. But her mind kept drifting. To the gate agent's skeptical glance, to the man's impatient sigh, to her son's hidden presence just rows ahead. She felt small, unseen, like a background figure in someone else's story. But what she didn't realize was this. She wasn't in the background at all. She was the reason the story existed. And soon, the whole cabin would know it. He'd been watching from the moment she walked into the terminal, sitting near a potted palm by the coffee shop, hoodie pulled low, sunglasses on despite the dim lighting. He looked like any other traveler killing time, but his eyes never left her. Every step she took, every pause she made, every time she adjusted the strap of her small suitcase, he saw it all. His chest tightened when she handed over her boarding pass at the gate. He saw the agent's face change. He heard the muffled exchange even from 20 feet away, and when she turned away, shoulders straight but spirit clearly bruised, he had to grip the edge of his seat to keep from standing up. He wanted to march over, to flash his ID, to say, "That's my mother, and she's flying exactly where she was promised." But he didn't. Not yet. Because he knew her. She'd raised him to handle things with grace, not grandstanding. She'd taught him that dignity wasn't something you demanded. It was something you carried even when others tried to strip it away. And if he stormed in now, it wouldn't be about her strength. It would be about his power. And that wasn't the lesson he wanted the world to see. So he waited. He'd spent the last 3 months learning to carry a different kind of weight, the weight of leading one of the largest airlines in the country. It hadn't happened overnight. Far from it. He'd started at the bottom, literally, hauling bags in the rain at Hartsfield-Jackson, soaked to the bone, earning just enough to help pay the electric bill back home. His mother never complained, even when the heat got cut off one winter. She'd just wrapped herself in an old quilt and said, "We've got each other." That's enough. He remembered those nights, studying for his GED under a flickering lamp while she mended uniforms for extra cash, walking 3 miles to the community college because the bus fare wasn't in the budget. Every no he'd ever heard, from loan officers, from hiring managers, from people who assumed his ambition was arrogance, had only made him dig deeper. And now? Now he sat in meetings where billionaires asked for his opinion. Now his name was in the business section, not the classifieds. But none of that mattered if the woman who gave him everything was being treated like she didn't belong in a seat she'd paid for. He'd planned this trip as a surprise. Not just the ticket, but the whole thing. He'd arranged for a car to pick her up, for a suite at the hotel near the awards venue, for flowers to be waiting in her room. He wanted her to feel seen, honored, celebrated, not just as his mother but as the quiet force behind every success he'd ever had. And then this happened. As he boarded the plane behind her, he kept his head down. He'd booked himself in a middle seat in economy, 27D, just one row ahead and across the aisle, close enough to keep an eye on her, far enough not to draw attention. The flight attendants didn't recognize him. Why would they? In the corporate offices, he wore tailored suits and spoke in boardroom cadence. Here, in faded jeans and a plain gray hoodie, he was just another face. But inside, his mind was racing. He knew the airline's policies backward and forward. There was no system error that would randomly bump a confirmed first-class passenger, especially not on a flight that wasn't even full. First class was half empty. He'd checked the manifest himself before boarding. So what really happened? The answer was ugly but clear. Someone looked at his mother, her age, her skin, her simple clothes, and decided she must have made a mistake. That she couldn't possibly belong up front. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened under his watch. Since taking the CEO role, he'd heard stories. Quiet complaints from loyal customers, offhand remarks in employee surveys. I was asked to show my ticket 3 times. They acted like I stole the seat. My child was told to be careful around me in the lounge. He'd launched diversity training, revised hiring practices, even added anonymous feedback channels. But policies on paper didn't always change hearts in real time, and now it had happened to her. He stole a glance back at her as the plane taxied down the runway. She was reading, her fingers tracing the lines of her Bible, her expression calm. But he knew that calm. It was the same look she'd worn the day his father's casket was lowered into the ground, steady on the outside, holding the whole world together inside. He wanted to go to her. To sit beside her, take her hand, tell her it would be okay. But he also knew that if he did, the moment would be about comfort, not justice. And what happened at that gate wasn't just a mistake, it was a pattern. And patterns needed to be broken publicly, not patched quietly. So he stayed put. As the plane leveled off, a flight attendant came down the aisle with a polite smile, offering drinks to economy passengers. When she reached his mother, she paused. "Ma'am," she said, her voice sweet but edged with something sharper. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" His mother looked up surprised. "I already showed it at the gate." "I know, but there's a discrepancy in our system," the attendant said, holding out her hand. "Just a quick check." His mother handed over the pass without protest. The attendant studied it, then frowned. This says first class." "Yes," his mother said simply. "It does." "Well," the attendant hesitated, glancing toward the front of the plane. "We're just making sure everything's in order. Sometimes people get confused about their seats." The words hung in the air like smoke. His mother didn't flinch. "I'm not confused. My son bought this ticket. He works in aviation. He made sure it was correct." The attendant's smile tightened. "Of course, ma'am, just try to stay in your assigned seat, okay? For everyone's comfort." She walked away before his mother could respond. He saw it all from his seat, the slight tremor in his mother's hands as she took back her pass. The way she looked out the window instead of at the people around her. She wasn't embarrassed. She was hurt, and that hurt cut deeper than any insult ever could. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. He'd spent his whole life trying to build a world where his mother wouldn't have to face moments like this, where her age, her race, her quiet demeanor wouldn't be used against her. And yet here they were, on a plane bearing his company's logo under his leadership. And she was being questioned like a suspect. That was the moment he decided. Not later. Not after the flight. Now. He unbuckled his seatbelt. He didn't storm. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood, walked calmly to the galley near the front of the economy section, and asked to speak with the lead flight attendant. The woman, older, with silver-streaked hair and a name tag that read Linda, eyed him warily. "Can I help you, sir?" "Yes," he said, keeping his voice low. "I need to show you something." He pulled out his corporate ID, the one with his photo, his title, and the airline's official seal. Linda's eyes widened. She glanced at it, then at him, then back at the ID. "Is this real?" she whispered. "It is," he said. "And I need to speak with the entire cabin crew before we reach cruising altitude." Linda swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't recognize you." "That's fine," he said. But what happened to my mother back there? That's not fine. Linda's face paled. Your mother? He nodded toward seat 28F. The woman in the lavender dress. She was denied her first-class seat at the gate without cause. Then just now she was publicly questioned as if she'd done something wrong. I watched it all. Linda looked like she might cry. I didn't know, sir, I swear. The gate agent said there was an overbooking issue. There wasn't, he said gently but firmly. First class has 8 empty seats. This wasn't logistics. It was assumption. He didn't say the word racism, he didn't have to. They both knew what hung in the silence. Bring the gate agent to the front, he said. She deadheaded on this flight, right? Linda nodded quickly. Yes, she's in 12C. Get her, and gather the rest of the crew. I'll be waiting. He turned and walked back toward his mother. The cabin was quiet now. The usual chatter replaced by a low hum of curiosity. Passengers had noticed the exchange. Some were watching. Others pretended not to, but their eyes kept flicking toward the aisle. He stopped beside his mother's seat. She looked up at him, confusion and worry in her eyes. What's going on? He knelt so they were eye to eye. Mama, he said softly, you don't have to sit here. Her breath caught. What do you mean? He took her hand, warm, familiar, the hand that had held his when he was scared, that had wiped his tears, that had worked until it was rough and tired. You were right. You belong in first class, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. Tears welled in her eyes. But why are you dressed like that? Why didn't you say something at the gate? Because I wanted you to know, he said, that even when the world doubts you, you're still worthy. And sometimes the best way to prove that isn't by shouting, but by standing tall until someone finally sees you. He helped her to her feet. She smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and nodded. Then he turned to the cabin. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't need to. His voice was calm, clear, and carried the weight of someone who didn't need to prove his authority because it was already there. For those who don't know, he said, my name is on the side of this airplane. I run this airline. And the woman walking with me right now, my mother, flies first class. Not because I said so just now, but because she earned it a long time ago. A beat of silence, then from the back of the plane someone started clapping. It was soft at first, a single pair of hands. Then another joined, and another. Soon the whole cabin was applauding, not in spectacle, but in solidarity. In respect, his mother didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on him, her son, the boy she'd raised with love and leftovers and late-night prayers. And for the first time since the gate, she smiled, not a polite one, but a real one. The kind that starts in the heart and lights up the whole face. As they walked toward the front of the plane, past the curtain that separated economy from first class, he felt her squeeze his hand. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. Yes, I did, he said, because you taught me that how we treat people matters more than how much we own. She nodded, her eyes shining. And in that moment, as they stepped into the quiet luxury of first class where empty seats waited like silent apologies, he knew this wasn't just about a seat. It was about setting things right, not just for her, but for everyone who'd ever been told, with a glance or a tone or a policy, that they didn't belong. The moment they stepped past the curtain into first class, the air itself seemed to change. It was quieter, softer, like the cabin knew it had crossed into a different kind of space. The harsh hum of the engines faded into a gentle background murmur. The overhead lights glowed warmer. Even the scent was different, clean linen and something faintly citrus, not the stale mix of coffee and plastic that lingered in economy. Eleanor didn't say a word as her son guided her to seat 1A, the very spot printed on her boarding pass. A flight attendant, new, younger, eyes wide with nervous recognition, rushed over, stammering an apology before she even reached them. I'm so sorry, ma'am. We didn't realize. Nobody told us. It's all right, Eleanor said gently, cutting her off with a small wave of her hand. Mistakes happen, but they both knew this wasn't just a mistake. Her son helped her settle into the wide, cushioned seat. He adjusted the headrest, tucked her small suitcase into the overhead bin, and even unfolded the blanket draped over the armrest before placing it across her lap. The attendants hovered nearby, unsure whether to speak, serve, or simply disappear. One of them brought a glass of sparkling water without being asked, setting it down with trembling hands. Eleanor took a slow sip, her eyes scanning the cabin. Empty seats surrounded them. Plenty of room, just as her son had said. She glanced toward the galley, where the lead flight attendant stood talking in hushed, urgent tones with the gate agent from earlier, the young woman with the perfect hair and the skeptical eyes. The gate agent kept shaking her head, arms crossed, face flushed. She looked more defensive than sorry. Eleanor sighed. She didn't want drama. She never had. But she also knew that sometimes quiet acceptance only lets the wrong things keep happening. Her son sat beside her in 1B, finally removing his sunglasses. He looked tired, not from the flight but from the weight of everything that had just unfolded. She reached over and touched his arm. "You didn't have to make a scene," she said softly. "I didn't make a scene, Mama," he replied, his voice low. "I just told the truth." She studied his face, the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw. He looked like his father, but the calm in him. That was all her. She remembered how, even as a boy, he'd never yelled when someone was unfair. He'd just work harder, prove them wrong with his actions, not his anger. Still, she worried. "What will they say about you? About us?" He gave her a small smile. "They'll say I stood up for my mother, and if that's a problem for anyone, then they don't belong in this company." Before she could respond, the lead flight attendant approached again, this time with 2 others behind her. They stood just outside the first row, shoulders stiff, eyes downcast. "Sir," Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper, "we'd like to apologize properly." He nodded. "Go ahead." Linda took a breath. "We failed today, not just in procedure but in basic human decency. Mrs. Hayes was treated as if she didn't belong here, when in fact she belongs more than most of us ever will." She glanced at Eleanor, her eyes glistening. "You raised a man who leads with integrity, and we dishonored that by doubting you." The other attendants murmured agreement. Even the gate agent, now standing at the edge of the group, gave a stiff nod. Eleanor looked at them, not with anger, but with something deeper. "Understanding, maybe, or sadness. I've been doubted before," she said quietly. "By teachers who thought my son couldn't learn. By landlords who said our neighborhood wasn't right for their building. By cashiers who followed me in stores. It never gets easier. But it shouldn't be your job to make me prove I'm worthy of a seat." The words landed like stones in still water. One of the younger attendants wiped her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small tissue, handing it to the girl. "You don't have to cry," she said kindly. "Just remember this feeling. And next time, give someone the benefit of the doubt before you assume the worst." The crew exchanged glances, then nodded in unison. Her son watched the exchange, pride swelling in his chest. This was why he'd waited, not to shame them, but to show them. To let them see the woman behind the stereotype, the dignity behind the doubt. After they left, the cabin settled into a new kind of quiet. Passengers in first class who had watched the whole thing unfold began offering small gestures. A man in 2A handed over a fresh copy of the morning paper. A woman in 3C smiled warmly and said, "Welcome, Mrs. Hayes." Even the pilot came on the intercom a few minutes later with an unusually personal message. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to have special guests on board today. Please enjoy the rest of your flight." Eleanor leaned back, finally relaxing. The plush seat cradled her like an old friend. She looked out the window at the endless blue sky, clouds drifting like cotton balls. She thought about all the times she'd looked up at the sky from her kitchen window, wondering if her son was safe, if he was eating enough, if he remembered to call his grandmother. Now here she was, flying through that same sky, wrapped in comfort, with him beside her. "You've come a long way," she said after a while. He chuckled. "We both have." She turned to him. "Tell me how this happened. How you ended up in charge." He hesitated, then nodded. "It wasn't planned. I never woke up one day and said, I'm going to run an airline. It just built piece by piece." He told her about the early days, loading luggage in the rain, memorizing flight codes during breaks, staying late to help mechanics troubleshoot. How he'd taken night classes while working full-time. How he'd been passed over for promotions 3 times before finally getting a shot as a junior operations analyst. How he'd learned to speak the language of finance, of safety protocols, of customer experience, not to impress but to understand. And then, she asked. Then I started asking questions others wouldn't, he said. Why do we treat frequent flyers better than first-time travelers? Why do our staff manuals say assume good intent, but our training videos show only white faces in leadership roles? Why do we measure success by profit alone and not by how people feel when they fly with us? He paused. One day the board called me in. They said, you see the cracks in the system. Fix them. So I did. And when the former CEO retired, they asked me to step in. Eleanor listened, her heart full. She remembered the nights he'd come home exhausted, smelling of jet fuel and coffee. His shoes worn thin. She'd always made sure there was a plate of food waiting, even if it was just beans and rice. She never asked if he was going to be rich. She only asked if he was being honest, if he was being kind. And now, she said, now that you're at the top? Now, he said, looking at her, I make sure no mother has to sit in the back because someone decided she didn't look like she belonged up front. She reached over and squeezed his hand again. You've always had a good heart. I got it from you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the clouds. The flight attendants returned with warm towels, gourmet meals on real china, and a selection of wines. Eleanor chose tea, her usual, but accepted the meal with grace. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if tasting not just food but the fullness of this moment. Halfway through the meal, the gate agent, the one from the counter, approached their row. She stood at the edge of the aisle, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Mrs. Hayes, she said, voice shaky. Eleanor looked up. Yes? The young woman swallowed hard. I owe you a real apology. Not because my boss told me to, but because I was wrong. I saw you and I made an assumption. I didn't think someone like you would have a first-class ticket, and that says more about me than it does about you. Eleanor studied her face, the flushed cheeks, the downcast eyes, the genuine regret. She saw not malice, but ignorance. And ignorance, she knew, could be unlearned. What's your name? Eleanor asked. Tiffany, the young woman said. Tiffany, Eleanor repeated gently. Do you have a mother? Tiffany blinked. Yes, ma'am. Would you want someone to treat her the way you treated me? Tiffany's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head. No, ma'am, never. Then remember this, Eleanor said. Next time you see someone who doesn't look like the people you're used to seeing in first class, pause. Ask yourself why that surprises you, and then treat them like a human being, not a problem to be solved. Tiffany nodded, tears spilling over. Thank you, she whispered. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back toward the galley, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Eleanor sighed. I hope she learns. She will, her son said, because you gave her a chance to. As the meal ended and the cabin lights dimmed slightly for rest, Eleanor leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She wasn't sleeping, just resting, letting the hum of the engine soothe her. She thought about the years of sacrifice, the lonely nights, the prayers whispered into pillowcases. She thought about how she'd once sold her wedding ring to pay for his college application fees. How she'd lied and said she wasn't hungry so he could have seconds at dinner. And now, here he was, leading an entire airline, changing policies, standing up for people like her. She opened her eyes and looked at him. He was staring out the window, lost in thought, the reflection of clouds passing over his face. You know, she said softly, I never needed you to be famous. I just needed you to be good. He turned to her, his eyes soft. Being good was the easy part, Mama. You made sure of that. She smiled. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by luxury she never asked for but deeply deserved, Eleanor Hayes finally felt seen, not as a passenger, not as a problem, but as exactly who she was, a mother, a teacher, a woman of quiet strength who had shaped a leader without ever seeking the spotlight. And sometimes, the world finally catches up to the truth, even if it takes a first-class seat and a son who runs an airline, to make it happen. The rest of the flight passed in a quiet rhythm. Soft lighting, gentle service, the occasional murmur of conversation from other first-class passengers. Eleanor dozed lightly, wrapped in the warmth of the blanket and the rare comfort of being treated like she mattered. Her son sat beside her, occasionally glancing at his phone, but mostly watching the clouds drift past the window, his mind already turning toward what came next. He knew this moment wouldn't end when the plane landed. What happened at the gate, what unfolded in the cabin, it wasn't just a personal slight. It was a symptom, and symptoms needed treatment, not just a bandage. When the captain announced their final descent into Los Angeles, the cabin stirred to life. Flight attendants moved quietly down the aisle, collecting trays, offering mints, checking seatbelts. Eleanor straightened her dress, smoothed her hair, and took a deep breath. She wasn't nervous, but she knew eyes would be on them when they deplaned. Not just from the crew, but from passengers who'd witnessed everything. As the plane taxied to the gate, her son leaned toward her. "There's going to be a car waiting for you outside," he said. "Black sedan. Driver will have your name on a sign. He'll take you straight to the hotel. Your suite's ready. Ocean view, just like you like." She nodded. "And you?" "I've got a meeting with the executive team as soon as we land," he said. "But I'll be at the hotel by 6. The award ceremony starts at 7. She reached over and touched his arm. "You don't have to fix everything today." "I'm not trying to fix everything," he said gently. "Just the part that hurt you." The plane came to a stop. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Around them, passengers began gathering their things. But no one stood right away. No one wanted to be the first to walk past them. There was a kind of reverence in the air now, respect wrapped in silence. Then from the back of first class, an older man in a navy blazer stood. He turned toward Eleanor, gave a small bow of his head, and said, "It was an honor to share this flight with you, ma'am." Others followed suit, murmured thanks, warm smiles, quiet nods. One woman even reached out and squeezed Eleanor's hand as she passed. "Your son's a good man," she whispered. "And you raised him right." Eleanor simply said, "Thank you," her voice steady, her heart full. When it was their turn to disembark, her son walked slightly ahead, not to lead but to clear the way. Ground staff stood at the jet bridge, eyes wide as they recognized him. One of them nearly dropped his clipboard, but her son didn't acknowledge them, not yet. He waited until Eleanor stepped onto the jet bridge, then fell into step beside her. Outside the plane, the terminal buzzed with the usual chaos, rolling suitcases, chattering families, gate agents calling out flight numbers. But as they walked toward baggage claim, something shifted. People noticed them, not because of flashy clothes or loud voices, but because of the quiet dignity they carried together. At the baggage carousel, Eleanor's small suitcase appeared quickly. Her son lifted it easily, then guided her toward the exit. Just before they stepped outside, he paused. "Mama," he said, "whatever happens next, don't be surprised, and don't feel bad for anyone." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You'll see." He led her through the sliding doors into the bright California sun. And there, waiting just beyond the curb, was not one car but 3. A black sedan with a driver holding a sign that read Mrs. Hayes. A second car with 2 airline executives in suits looking anxious. And a third vehicle, a small news van with a satellite dish on top, though no cameras were rolling yet. The executives hurried forward as soon as they saw him. "Sir, thank you for landing safely. We heard what happened on the flight. We've already started an internal review." He didn't shake their hands. He just nodded. "Good, but this isn't just about one flight. It's about a pattern." One of the executives, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward. "We agree. We'd like to invite you and your mother to a special briefing this afternoon. We're drafting new protocols, mandatory bias training, revised customer verification procedures. We want your input." Eleanor listened, surprised. She hadn't expected this, not so quickly. Her son looked at her. "What do you think, Mama?" She hesitated, then said, "If it helps someone else avoid what I went through, then yes." The executives visibly relaxed. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. Your perspective is invaluable." As they spoke, the driver of the sedan approached quietly. "Ma'am, your car's ready." Eleanor turned to her son. "You go ahead with your meeting. I'll rest at the hotel." He hugged her then, right there in the terminal in front of everyone. Not a quick pat, but a real embrace, the kind that said, "I see you. I honor you. I'm proud of you. I'll see you at 6, he whispered. She nodded, climbed into the car and watched as he turned to face the executives, his posture shifting from son to leader in an instant. The drive to the hotel was smooth and quiet. The driver, a kind man in his 50s, didn't ask questions. He just played soft jazz on the radio and kept the air conditioning at a comfortable level. Eleanor stared out the window at the palm trees, the ocean in the distance, the city unfolding before her. She thought about how far she'd come, from a cramped apartment in Atlanta to a luxury suite in Los Angeles, all because of love and hard work and a little boy who never forgot where he came from. At the hotel, she was greeted like royalty. The front desk staff knew her name. The bellhop carried her suitcase without being asked. Her room key was handed to her with a warm smile. "Welcome, Mrs. Hayes. Your son called ahead. He said you like chamomile tea. We've left a pot in your suite." She thanked them and took the elevator to the top floor. The suite was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a balcony overlooking the Pacific, fresh flowers on the table, and yes, a steaming pot of chamomile tea on the sideboard. She set her purse down, walked to the balcony, and stepped outside. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, waves rolling in with a steady rhythm. She closed her eyes and breathed in the salt air. For the first time in a long time, she felt peace. But that peace didn't last long. An hour later, a soft knock came at the door. She opened it to find a young woman in a crisp airline uniform holding a tablet. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm with the corporate communications team. Your son asked if you'd be willing to join a short virtual meeting. It's just the leadership team. No press, no recordings. They'd like to hear your thoughts on how we can do better." Eleanor hesitated. She wasn't used to being asked for her opinion by executives, but then she remembered the gate agent's face, the flight attendant's tears, the way her son had looked at her with such quiet determination. "All right," she said, "but only if you promise to listen, not just hear." The woman smiled. "We promise." The call lasted 40 minutes. Eleanor spoke plainly, without anger, without blame. She talked about the look in the gate agent's eyes, the assumption that she must be mistaken. She described how being questioned in front of others made her feel invisible, even though she'd done nothing wrong. She suggested simple changes. Train staff to verify tickets privately, not publicly. Teach them to say, "Let me check on that for you," instead of, "That can't be right." Remind them that dignity costs nothing, but denying it costs everything. The executives took notes. Asked thoughtful questions. Didn't interrupt. When the call ended, the young woman said, "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. You've given us more than policy ideas. You've given us a compass." Later that afternoon, while Eleanor was napping, her son arrived. He looked tired but focused. He sat on the edge of the couch in her suite, a cup of coffee in hand. "They're moving fast," he said. "By next week, every frontline employee, gate agents, flight attendants, customer service reps, will go through a new training module. It's called See the Person, Not the Assumption, and they're adding a new rule. No passenger will be questioned about their seat in front of others. Ever." Eleanor nodded. "That's a start." "It is," he said. "But I want to do more." He told her about an idea he'd been turning over since the flight. "I want to create a program, named after you, that supports families who work in aviation but can't afford to fly to see their loved ones. Baggage handlers, cleaners, ramp agents, they keep this industry running, but they rarely get to enjoy it. I want to give them free tickets. First class if they want." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. "You'd do that for me?" "No," he said softly. "I'd do it because of what you taught me. That everyone deserves to be seen, especially the ones no one notices." She reached for his hand. "You've made me so proud." "I'm just walking the path you paved," he said. That evening, as they prepared for the award ceremony, Eleanor put on the dress he'd sent, a deep plum gown, elegant but not flashy. He helped her with the clasp on her necklace, the same one his father had given her on their 20th anniversary. "You look beautiful." "Mama," he said. "So do you," she replied, smoothing his lapel. The ceremony was held in a grand ballroom downtown. Cameras flashed as they entered. People whispered as they passed. But Eleanor walked tall, her head high, her hand resting lightly on her son's arm. When he was called to the stage to receive his award, Visionary Leader of the Year, the room rose in applause. But he didn't start his speech with thanks to the board or the investors. He began with her. "Tonight," he said, his voice clear and steady, "I accept this honor not for myself, but for every mother who worked 2 jobs so her child could dream, for every woman who was told she didn't belong, on a plane, in a boardroom, in a first-class seat, and sat down anyway with grace. And especially for my mother, who taught me that true leadership isn't about power. It's about protecting people's dignity, especially when no one's watching." He turned and looked directly at her in the front row. "You were denied a seat today," he said, "but you never lost your place. And because of you, no one else will have to." The room fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in applause louder and longer than any before. Eleanor didn't stand. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room already knew where she belonged, and for the first time, the world saw her not as a problem to be solved, but as the heart of a story worth telling. The morning after the award ceremony, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the hotel suite, painting golden stripes across the carpet. Eleanor sat at the small table on the balcony, wrapped in a soft robe, sipping her tea and watching the ocean. The city below was already awake. Cars moving along the coast highway, joggers on the boardwalk, seagulls circling lazily in the sky. But up here, everything felt still, like the world was holding its breath. She hadn't slept much, not because she was restless, but because her mind kept replaying the night before, the applause, the speech, the way her son had looked at her from the stage, eyes shining with love and pride. She'd spent most of her life in the background, making sure others had what they needed while quietly setting her own wants aside. To be seen so openly, so honorably, it was overwhelming in the best way. A soft knock came at the door. She called out, "Come in," and her son stepped inside dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, no tie, no jacket. He looked more like the boy she remembered than the CEO the world now knew. "Morning, Mama," he said, carrying 2 paper cups. "Brought you coffee. And a croissant. The flaky kind you like." She smiled as he set the cup down beside her. "You remembered." "I remember everything," he said, sitting across from her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the waves. Then he said, "The board met this morning. They approved everything, the training, the new verification policy, even the program I told you about." She turned to him. "The one named after me?" He nodded. "The Eleanor Hayes Initiative. Starting next month, any frontline aviation worker, baggage handlers, cleaners, gate assistants can apply for 2 free round-trip tickets per year. First class if they choose, no questions asked." Her eyes filled with tears. That's too much." "It's not," he said gently. "It's just fair. These people keep the skies running, but they've never gotten to enjoy them. Now they will. And it'll carry your name, not because you asked for it, but because your life taught me what fairness really looks like." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," he said. "But I wanted to." Later that day, they returned home. The flight back was different, no disguises, no hidden seats. They boarded together through the first-class entrance, greeted by the same gate agent from their outbound trip. This time the young woman's eyes were red-rimmed, her posture humble. She didn't say much, just handed Eleanor her boarding pass with both hands and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me." Eleanor simply nodded. No anger, no lecture, just grace. Back in Atlanta, life settled into its familiar rhythm. Eleanor returned to her small apartment, watered her plants, checked her mail, and called her church friends to thank them for their prayers. But things weren't quite the same. Not because she'd changed, but because the world around her had started to shift. A week after they got home, a letter arrived from the airline. It wasn't corporate or formal. It was handwritten, from the lead flight attendant, Linda. She wrote about how the incident had shaken her, how she'd gone home that night and cried, not out of fear of losing her job, but out of shame for failing to see a human being. She said she'd signed up to lead the new bias training sessions, and was working with young recruits to teach them what service with dignity really meant. Another letter came from a baggage handler at Hartsfield-Jackson, the very airport where her son had once worked. He'd heard about the new initiative and wrote to say his daughter was graduating high school in California. He'd never been able to afford a ticket to see her walk across the stage. Now, thanks to the program, he would. "You gave me back a piece of my heart," he wrote. "I'll never forget it." Eleanor kept those letters in a special box on her dresser next to the photo of her late husband. Meanwhile, her son didn't stop. He rolled out the changes across the entire airline. Within 2 months, every employee, from call center staff to pilots, had completed the new training. Customer complaints about unfair treatment dropped by nearly 60%. More importantly, internal surveys showed a real shift. Employees felt more empowered to speak up when they saw something wrong. He also made one more change. Quiet, but powerful. He moved his office from the executive suite on the top floor to a smaller space near the operations center, where he could hear the real heartbeat of the company, the radio chatter from the tarmac, the calls from customer service, the hum of people doing the work that kept everything flying. One Sunday afternoon, Eleanor visited him at the office. She brought sweet potato pie, his favorite. He met her in the lobby, took the pie with a grin, and led her through the building. Along the way, people stopped to greet her, not as the CEO's mother, but as Mrs. Hayes. Some even asked for her advice on raising kind children or staying strong through hard times. She always answered with patience and warmth. In his office, she noticed something new on the wall, a framed photo from the flight. It wasn't of him receiving an award or shaking hands with executives. It was a candid shot someone had taken mid-cabin, her sitting in 28F, head bowed over her Bible, sunlight catching the silver in her hair. Underneath it, a small plaque read, "Dignity doesn't ask for permission. It just is." She touched the frame, her throat tight. "You kept this?" "I look at it every morning," he said. "It reminds me why I do this job." Months passed. The story of what happened on that flight didn't go viral in the usual sense. No sensational headlines, no angry debates online. Instead, it spread quietly like a ripple in water. A teacher used it in a lesson about respect. A pastor mentioned it in a sermon about unseen heroes. A group of flight attendants started a mentorship program for young women of color entering the industry, naming it the Eleanor Circle. And then came the invitation. It was for a national conference on equity in transportation. They wanted Eleanor to speak, not as a victim, but as a voice of wisdom. At first, she refused. "I'm not a public speaker," she told her son. "I'm just a retired school aide." But he looked at her and said, "Mama, you've been speaking your whole life, with your actions, your kindness, your quiet strength. Maybe it's time the world hears your words too." So she agreed. On the day of the conference, she stood at the podium in a simple navy dress, her hands folded in front of her. The room was full. Hundreds of people from airlines, rail companies, city transit departments. She didn't read from notes. She just spoke from her heart. "I never asked for attention," she began. "I just wanted to fly in the seat my son paid for. But what happened that day showed me something important, that how we treat people in small moments says everything about who we are as a society." She talked about the power of pause, how one extra second of kindness could change a person's whole day. She spoke about the danger of assumptions, how they build walls between people without anyone even noticing. And she ended with this: "I'm not here because I was wronged. I'm here because I was seen. And if my story helps one person choose kindness over suspicion, then every moment of that flight was worth it." The audience gave her a standing ovation, not because she was famous, but because she was real. Afterward, people lined up to thank her. A young gate agent, tears in her eyes, said, "I used to think first class was only for certain kinds of people. Now I know it's for anyone who buys a ticket and deserves to be treated like a human." Eleanor hugged her. Back home, life returned to its gentle pace. She still watered her plants, still went to church on Sundays, still made extra soup for her neighbor when he was sick. But now, when she walked into the grocery store or the post office, people sometimes smiled a little wider, held the door a little longer. Not because she was important, but because they'd learned, through her story, to see the worth in everyone. Her son visited every Sunday without fail. They'd sit on her porch, drink iced tea, and talk about everything and nothing. He never bragged about his work. He just asked how she was, what she'd read lately, if her roses were blooming one evening. As the sun dipped below the trees, she turned to him and said, "You know, I used to worry that success would change you." He smiled. "And did it?" She looked at him, really looked, and saw the same boy who used to trace letters on her palm, who cried when his goldfish died, who saved his lunch money to buy her a birthday card. "No," she said softly, "it didn't, and that's your greatest victory." He reached over and took her hand. "Then I did something right." Years later, long after the headlines faded and the conferences ended, people in the aviation world would still tell the story, not as gossip, but as a lesson. They'd say, "Remember the woman in the lavender dress? That's the day we learned that leadership isn't just about running a company. It's about protecting people's humanity." And in a quiet apartment in Atlanta, Eleanor Hayes would sit by her window, Bible in her lap, watching the sky. Sometimes, when a plane passed overhead, she'd smile. Not because it carried her name, but because it carried hope. Hope that the world was learning, slowly but surely, to see people not for what they look like, but for who they are. And that, more than any award or title, was the legacy she and her son had built together, one act of quiet courage at a time.